Hey everyone, welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Make sure and check us out on all your typical podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. Today we are joined by Naji, who is another member of ScholarAI, and I'm going to kick it to Lakshay to introduce Naji.
Yeah, so welcome Naji to the podcast. Naji's been with us for, I guess I first interviewed you, Naji, like last November. So we're kind of
Yeah.
approaching like almost a year. Not just kind of one of our first hires. Um, we were actually interviewing I was in India at the time. Like this was like November, like OpenAI Dev Day just happened. We're reacting to a lot of stuff.
I remember.
But Naji's been with the team for a long time. Like has obviously kind of seen a lot of the startup, like for a lot of kind of what we've been through, like what we've been learning, experiencing. His background is also pretty interesting, but I kind of want to just like leave it to him to maybe talk through how he got to Scholar
Yeah, definitely. So, man, I feel like it's like a rush of kind of like memories and emotions, like thinking back to first interviewing here and then like all this stuff, we've kind of done along the way and then trying to connect that to kind of my background. So, I mean, I'm a software engineer. Initially was working at at a med device company. I saw Scholar AI, we connected, was a great match and kind of joined the team. And since then it's just been like a flurry of work and many hats to wear and many things to build. So it's really cool. I mean, you're learning a lot, especially within an industry that's like ever changing and changing rapidly as well. So you're always like inundated with like new technologies, new ways of kind of approaching to solving like AI problems. So many like new learnings and great experience to be a part of a team who's just extremely knowledgeable. And I feel like our team has a great rapport and energy that is like sent back and forth between one each other. So definitely really awesome experience to say the least. So glad to be here, and hopefully we can continue to take the company forward and continue to innovate on products and technologies as well.
I know this is also something that's very interesting about you, but like your background, like what you studied in like school and whatnot, it's not CS, right? Like what was your
Mhm.
journey there? How did you end up becoming an engineer?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So I actually studied quantitative economics at Cal Poly, and I initially wanted to get into like investment banking. Um, However, that was kind of like a little bit rough for me to break into there. And then I was just reached out by a recruiter at Apple to get a QA engineering job, and took it, ran with it, learned how to code, started coding on the job. Then applied for another took some classes at a JC, did a few of my own little projects, applied to entry level software engineering job, and it kind of went from there. I think that's where I realized, okay, like yeah, there's coding, but then there's software engineering, which are they're interrelated but fairly two different types of things. And so yeah, I mean, a lot of my learnings are just like hands on, you know, in the industry, learn on the fly, kind of get thrown in the fire plenty of times. And I guess that really, maybe I think of myself as like a samurai sword, that gets thrown into fire and hammered on. So it's like strong. But yeah, I guess non-conventional like background, but always kind of lead my life with the motto or belief that you can always learn anything at any given point in time, depending on how much work you put in. And yeah, I think that's a skill and trait that is important for everyone to have. So you can stay adaptable and, always grow your knowledge.
Absolutely. Do you think, obviously we kind of talk a lot about like the state of tech and where things are going. As someone who spent a lot of time, like kind of getting into technology in like the unconventional, like unorthodox route, what would you say for like, with the state of technology and the way you see things going, like what advice would you have for someone who might be like interested in technology, but doesn't really know like where they think things are going, whether it's still a good investment? Like what should someone who is considering technology be doing today?
I would say like take a step back, right? And so like realize that, we're entering this fourth industrial revolution, and there's going to be changes in the means of production, the mean we exchange information, the means how we exchange value as well. And I think as it relates to like technology, just like kind of like pick one of those areas and then try to position yourself with what, you know, where you learn about, like, let's say for AI, for example, right? Like that is going to change like a lot of the means of how we produce, right? From robotics to, you know, this using LLMs. And so I would say really gain knowledge in those industries, and then do projects and communicate, you know, or like connect with people. That it's just learn by doing. I feel like that's just the best way. That's how I did it. So, but first step would be to say like, where's the world going? You know, how is the world moving? And then based on like where we see the trajectory going, kind of position yourself accordingly and focus in those areas.
Naji, I think one of the things that it was fascinating is people that often kind of wander into the startup life often have kind of unique experiences. And I know that you had a very unique experience playing professional soccer. Not exactly sure how you would designate it, but maybe just give us a couple sentences on what that experience was like and how you think that maybe prepared you for the adversity that is so typical of startups.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I also played D1 at Cal Poly, and my whole life, you know, that was, you know, soccer was like a big part of my life competitively. You know, it was a very serious piece of my life where, you know, you train a lot, right? And so I guess like one thing that I feel like helped me prepare for like the startup life is that there's many times in your career where you're going to be kind of pushed to the test, and you know, you may be like presented with some like very strong adversity, which will really test your commitment to doing what you do. And I think having like, you know, been put through the test and like been pushed to the point where like, hey, you think of quitting, um, and you don't quit, kind of is like a great trait to like have within the startup world, because there'll be many times where you just feel like, man, I'm doing everything I can, and then, you know, you just need to keep pushing, and like you might have like a failure on some point, but if you accept that failure and quit, then, you know, you kind of let everything go. But there's been many times where I've been pushed to that point where I felt like I needed to quit playing, but I didn't quit, and I keep kind of being patient, keep working through everything, and like so many other doors opened, and like I exceeded, you know, in kind of my career. So really the persistence and like perseverance traits that you can that I feel like I gained from my career as a soccer player helped me a lot, you know, with being within the startup world, because it is pretty grindy at times, you know. So I feel like that definitely helps a lot.
I didn't realize you were D1, man. When we've talked about like the soccer and like bantered about it within the tech group, like it's all been very casual. And now realizing you're D1, I'm a little intimidated, dude. I wasn't expecting
man. No intimidation. No intimidation, man. It's all fun, you know. I do lessons as well too, you know. So if you ever want, training,
perfect. Yeah,
we're good. Okay. I got you.
I'm up in Seattle.
Damon, were you D1 basketball?
No. So not D1. I actually played at a level that is classified as NAIA. It's a different classification. It's essentially lower than Division II. So kind of the hierarchy of traditional kind of American collegiate sports is Division I, Division II, NAIA Division I, which is the last rung that actually gives athletic scholarships. And then below that, you have things like NAIA Division II and NCAA Division III. And so that's kind of the level that I played at. So yeah, it is interesting though. I mean, I think that I can echo some of the sentiment that Naji relayed, which is the adversity that you go through in competitive sports doesn't necessarily have to be sports, but competitive kind of anything. It does teach you, as he was saying, how to kind of get knocked down, get back up, and just kind of build that intestinal fortitude that it kind of takes to do really hard things, and kind of inspires confidence that you can go and learn new things. And I think that Naji's career trajectory and history is a testament to that. I think that it can be very intimidating for some people to make a career transition, especially later in their education, right? To go from, like you said, economics essentially to software engineering. I think that there's a history of experiences there that allowed you to kind of take that leap, and it obviously is paying off, and we're thrilled to kind of have you. So thanks for joining us on this podcast, and we'll kind of turn our attention to some other kind of current events, and then feel free to kind of chime in. So Lakshay, I'm going to tee you up again here to give us kind of the rundown. So as you all are hearing this, hopefully the kind of problems that Lakshay is getting ready to describe have resolved. But Lakshay, why don't you go ahead and tee up kind of what's going on right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So for anyone who hasn't been following like tech world or hasn't been impacted by this, if you were trying to fly today, you'd be probably going through a lot of hell because there is a cybersecurity provider that Microsoft has called Crowdstrike. What they did is that they pushed an update to their drivers that automatically installed on Windows computers around the world that basically forced this unrecoverable blue screen across every single like Windows terminal in the world. So a lot of the FAA and their airlines are struggling because they simply can't interact with their terminals. They're just all blue screens. Retail locations like warehouses, a lot of what is the functioning like operating system for the world is down. And we're seeing like ramifications of that on like critical infrastructure and all that sort of stuff, which has then been the hot topic of the day, especially that one company and one provider could just push an update that does that. For the record, it's not a cybersecurity attack. It's not like a defense issue. It's just simply a bad update gone wrong that led to this sort of international catastrophe for technology.
I've got some questions. I mean, walk us through a little bit around how a system like that can be affected by a design push. And what I mean by that is, I think it stands to reason that this company has several employees, probably large teams of engineers that push things in sequential steps. So, in our organization and others, we typically go from a development pipeline to a test pipeline to a production pipeline. So walk us through kind of what the traditional engineering pipeline looks like that at the enterprise grade, and kind of where, speculate, if you will, a little bit about where you think one of these kind of quality control or, similar checks might have failed that allowed this to happen.
Yeah, with a company that big and that has clientele that big, I would anticipate that like, for starters, like their code is kernel level access. For anyone who's listening that doesn't really know what that means, in your computer's operating system, the kernel is basically like the most base layer a program can touch that knows about everything, right? So anything that you do that's private, if you have a system that has kernel level access, it has access to everything, basically. How the computer boots, all of the local files, everything at the core level that gets the software in your computer to run needs the kernel at the base layer, right? So CrowdStrike as a service has to touch kernel. They can only do cybersecurity because they're able to watch the kernel and watch other programs that are trying to access the kernel. And trying to deploy and test that sort of thing was pretty typical for general software. Like we run servers, we run cloud infrastructure, is you have tests along different kind of layers of the development paradigm. So does your code work, right? Does your code interplay well with other things it's supposed to? In their specific case, what I expect is that they also test against different operating systems. So when they deploy code, there would be automated tests running on like, hey, deploy this code to a Windows like micro server somewhere and make sure that that server is running as expecting them to accept these tests. In trying to understand how something like this could really happen, I'd be very surprised if it was like quality control that they just simply weren't doing the tests. I doubt that's like the issue. They're absolutely doing those sort of tests. What I think is most likely is that a live kind of real-time local machine is not representative of what their server like automated test machine was like. Like there just might be kind of like latent assumptions like what their very atomized test server is like versus like I'm going to download this file or download this new driver to our local machine that we're using for actual stuff and making sure that I'd assume what happened is that there was just a simple discrepancy between what the local machine and what the atomized box was set up to work as. So it looked completely okay here, but the moment it went live, there was something that clashed. The details of that are not yet known, but that's the kind of core of how something like this happens.
I mean, Lakshay, what the hell is going on here? Why would Microsoft let anyone touch the kernel of their code? Like Apple doesn't do that. You can't touch the kernel code in Apple.
Well,
why is Microsoft so bad at software?
There's it's very common that like increasingly so like there's kernel level access is something that has into cybersecurity has grown increasingly important. Apple, I assume like there's plenty of programs that run on Apple, but generally cybersecurity programs will probably touch kernel because the only way to ensure like true absolute security is to watch what else is in the kernel, right? So if someone gives you malware, odds are that malware is going to run boot up code that was going to try and get into the kernel, right? I don't think it's necessarily an issue of kernel level access. It's the issue of like pushing bad code to kernel level access. Because all of that's just a bare minimum kind of requirement of like, I need to know what viruses are in your system. If the viruses want to do something malicious, that happens inside of the kernel.
And I think that what it becomes curious to me is with Microsoft being, I kind of arguably the most widespread software, running the most versions, being the most kind of open source, quote unquote, of it all. It just feel like there is some vulnerability with how much of the world runs on Microsoft, and it feels like these. Yeah, granted that this one isn't an actual cybersecurity attack or kind of vulnerability, it does feel like the possibility for these things are increasing. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, it's just, I mean, as with anything, I mean, like, it is interesting to me that I don't know what the relationship between CrowdStrike, Microsoft, and these customers that were impacted is. I don't know if it's that these clients paid for CrowdStrike to then run on their machines, or if CrowdStrike is an implementation that Microsoft is offering kind of by default. Whichever one it is, like, it's pretty common, especially like in you'll find that like instances of like vulnerabilities, it's oftentimes these like secondary companies that live on top of a very widespread platform that ultimately provides like the gate into breaking something very impactful, right? It's obviously cybersecurity. I imagine it's a very typical case of like, it's better to buy than to build for Microsoft, where that's just such a complicated issue that it's better to have a third party company handle it. But it's kind of like Microsoft is one of the most valuable vaults. And it seems like in general, their approach is buy a lot of things that make a lot of doors into said vault. If any of those doors are crackable or vulnerable, then the entire vault is exposed.
Just adding a couple of bits here. So Elon's deleted CrowdStrike from all systems for all of his companies. There's been massive flight impact. I'll share a screen here just to show you the impact of air travel. Here's a visual
Oh my God.
of air travel impact. So I believe all airlines were down at some point today due to the CrowdStrike failure. Let's call it what it is, the failure. And so again, I come back to the question of Microsoft. What has Microsoft been great at? It's M&A. M&A is the thing that Microsoft has done incredibly well to increase their market cap. But Microsoft, at least in my opinion, I've never thought very highly of Microsoft as a software company. I've always thought it's been janky and buggy and not very well developed. The idea between going back to Jobs and Bill Gates is Bill Gates wanted an open platform where everybody could kind of modify and fork and version it, whereas Steve Jobs wanted a lockdown, secure, walled garden. And I think we're seeing the impacts of that long shadow of those philosophies play out over time, where in some ways it's great to have Android so you can fork many versions, but everybody knows Android's just buggier than iOS. It's less trustworthy. In the same way, we're seeing Microsoft approach be buggier, and that has massive impacts when security and uptime are really, really important.
One question that's kind of coming to my mind is, especially like when you think of like the cybersecurity industry, there's a lot of new companies coming out and a lot of new development happening. I wonder how much of this, was it build thing or break things, go fast kind of culture and attitude that some of these cybersecurity companies are, adopting. And if they are, should they be taking more time, being more diligent in their release process, and maybe even frequency of their release, their software releases? Because I mean, it's such a serious case, right? Like, look how big of an impact this is having, right? Like, what if there was like some kind of cybersecurity breach or some malware that got missed in testing, and now other systems are affected. Maybe it's not the airline industry. Maybe it's the banking industry. Maybe it's, some I don't know, some mining industry or something, electrical grid,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like increasingly, so my general sentiment is that like software is growing in how commoditized it is. Like, especially as it's just like, it is easier and easier for systems to generate code that do a job. In looking at things that way, like, I think cybersecurity is rising as a very popular thing to like build for, because the amount of code in the world goes up, the amount of demand for protection on said code also goes up. So I think my understanding is CrowdStrike is a fairly established company. Like, they're IPO'd and like they're very public. Yeah. Stock dropped by like 10 something percent today. But in that general space, I think we're probably going to be seeing a lot more companies or a lot more startups trying to do something cybersecurity oriented. And I think that's probably pretty dangerous given the nature of the way code development is going. Because I think increasingly, like, diligence on the quality of code you're writing is going down generally, just because these systems are the runs running the code, not the people. The likelihood of like introducing a vulnerability and not catching it, the likelihood of like introducing like a system weakness and not catching it, is just increasingly high, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of interesting stuff. I think some of the most interesting startups I've seen these days are like automated penetration testing. So they'll like act like a hacker for you, trying to like break into your system and figure out a way through. And that way like automatically catch these things without requiring like an actual human auditor that you have to pay like a couple $100,000 for. But that sort of stuff, it's in a weird time where amount of code is going up. Cybersecurity is still like a very fragile, delicate art where the top like 0.01% of hackers and penetration testers like can see through a lot of things. And most people have no idea how to correctly even like notice that they've introduced something of that nature.
Yeah.
I think one of the most famous examples of this kind of like chaos engineering is the Chaos Monkey example from Netflix. Are you guys familiar with this kind of story and origin?
No, I don't think I've heard of it.
I know this is a very kind of cursory level, but the quick summary or the Cliff Notes version is that Netflix realized how critical uptime was to user satisfaction scores, right? If you log in Netflix and you can't watch a movie because it's down in your area, then all of a sudden you start to turn off and you start to turn on other things. And so they famously kind of spent lots of time in this kind of realm of what they called chaos engineering, and essentially just trying to test with as much rigor as possible how resilient their servers were across their AWS services. I guess saying that different regions they kind of famously have spread out across kind of all of the available AWS microservice kind of landscape, so that they kind of are more resilient to these either hacks or power grid malfunctions or otherwise. So not directly relevant, but I just thought on the topic of how do you kind of decrease vulnerabilities, I think that Netflix is kind of the, the canonical example, I suppose, that people often point to when it comes to these kind of things. I want to pull on a thread though that you said, Lakshay. I just want to poke at it a little bit to get your 2 cents. You said, if I understood correctly, that you think there's perhaps increasing vulnerability due to lack of robustness of the codes being built, or the lack of thoughtfulness in kind of proofreading and or kind of making sure that it's secure once it's being built. I wonder if there is an opportunity for AI to play in that space of code review, because while AI is obviously capable of code generation and writing new code, I do wonder, with sufficient context, there's always problems of running out of context windows or not being able to upload the entire thing. But I'm just curious how that's falling on you. Is there, while I understand your point in that AI might be a catalyst for kind of increased error in the actual code generation itself, I'm wondering what you think its role may be as a proofreading engine as well.
I think there's kind of 2 things to this. I think one thing to kind of recognize is that a lot of software is built on it's a lot of Jenga towers, basically. Like, if someone makes an open source repo that is good at one thing, you can probably have a vulnerability that is almost kind of 18 layers deep in code you've never even looked at or considered that you might actually have running in your system, right? There's an example from this of maybe 1 or 2 years ago of something called log4j. Log4j was a library that was used for just logging outputs, right? So if I'm writing some code, I want to say hey, we got a 400 response. I want to log that on my service. A lot of people would use this system called log4j that would write that log out into the server. Really, really simple use case, right? Nothing super complicated. And a lot of other logging libraries were built on log4j. if you had like a different server implementation, they were built on those logging libraries, et cetera, et cetera. So you probably even know you're using Log4j, even though you were, right? And what ended up happening is that Log4j had a very critical vulnerability that was discovered like and announced to the world where, hey, wait a minute. If for whatever reason you're logging like a user input, so if some user types in like a byte string that can brick your system and your Log4j like line prints that, they're in. Basically, like they've cracked into your server and they have an entry point fundamentally into like your server's runtime. And so I think like there's kind of the layer of that is that as good as AI can get at code review, like there's an element that a lot of software is built on these very hidden layers of just like support of open source libraries and open community things that even if you were to like, let's say we discovered like Log4j2 had an incident today, right? To discover what I would need to fix in my system would not just require like looking at my code and seeing where I'm calling Log4j. It would require like looking at the libraries I'm using and where they're calling Log4j. If it goes even deeper, like, okay, all of a sudden now this library I'm using I know it has a vulnerability. The owners of this library pushed an update. Okay, let me push the update. And all of a sudden now my actual code doesn't work because it's not compatible with the way the new library works, right? It's all very fragile because it's built on a lot of core developments that if someone got wrong anywhere in history, you're bound to get wrong. Especially when you consider, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I found a good visual for you, Lecce.
Especially when you look at like security is one thing, but when you're just looking at like AI and how it understands code and the way it's been taught code, all of that's historical, right? So a lot of people might be downloading libraries that are old by default, right? They might already be installing vulnerabilities that have been solved, but because they're just using like systems that aren't looking at like the most modern implementations, they might get it wrong and introduce a vulnerability already.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly well said. I think it makes a lot of sense. Thanks for the helpful visual there. Josh, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of, is there a solve for this? Because I think everything that Lecce is kind of outlining is true, but I don't necessarily see an obvious path forward. I don't think the world of open source software libraries are going away. I don't think the human incentive to build on top of previously built things is going away. So I'm curious as to do you see anything that
I see it as a dislocation on the market. So if this will alert everyone to this vulnerability, which is it's actually, while this has created billions of dollars of global impact and damage, it's probably a lot cheaper than an international adversary trying to take down the airline system, for example. And if the vulnerability was that significant and if there was a path to brick all of these billions of dollars of Windows computers, then it's better to find out now. Also, I think the companies that have built critical infrastructure on Windows have earned it. Right? You build critical infrastructure on a Windows platform, you've gotten the thing that has at some point been coming your way, and this is an alert that it's time to upgrade infrastructure. I wonder, like you, Damon, whether there's an AI approach to identifying these vulnerabilities and addressing them proactively before we have these outages, whether that's at the code level or just as a system testing kind of approach constantly happening in the background. But again, my opinion of Windows is that it's just kind of janky code, and having kernel access to third parties, security provider or otherwise, is just a massive vulnerability. Apple doesn't do it, Windows does. And all the Apple users today are kind of laughing, and same for most Linux users, and Windows users are struggling, are in some hurt. So in the long run, I'd say these dislocations are good for the market. It's good for us to see the vulnerabilities. If some other company is better than Crowdstrike at this, Crowdstrike should get kicked out and the new company should be brought in. If your software stack is super old, you haven't addressed your tech stack, this is a great reminder of the impact to your business if you don't update your stack.
I wonder, as a kind of a little bit of a reach from a segue to what you were just describing, I wonder if there's more thoughts, maybe you start on the vulnerability of the world kind of in aggregate based on all of these software systems, right? Shashi is kind of loosely describing, while this may have been, kind of a happy accident in uncovering some of these vulnerabilities, there are obvious kind of, let's call them aggressive forces across the world who are looking to do these things on purpose. And I'm curious how that kind of falls on your ears. Are there things that we could do as a software company as we think about building, or is it simply up to somebody else besides the individual companies themselves to help secure kind of these, like you described them, these Jenga towers of systems?
Yeah, there's also, I don't know, we didn't really talk about this when this happened because it was like so techie in nature. Like it was very, very specifically in the engineer like newsletter sort of paradigm of things to talk about. But there was a couple of months ago, I'm forgetting what this issue was called, but some nefarious actor, there was some open source repo that was used in a lot of places. There's an open source repo that an engineer, I think from Microsoft, don't quote me on that. I think it was Microsoft. They were working on this open source repo, contributing to it, whatever. This one engineer noticed that the runtime, like the speed of query, was like a couple milliseconds off. So first off, like incredible observation that led to him discovering like a vulnerability that some nefarious actor had been contributing to the repo over the course of something like a year, right? There was someone who had been trying to like create like a launch that introduced a vulnerability into a widespread system that ultimately like someone just happened to catch because they were like so in tune with what this code was supposed to do and how it's supposed to be operating that when they noticed a little bit of a slowdown, they began poking around and saw a vulnerability introduced by some GitHub contributor over the course of a very, very long coordinated period, right? So incredible story just insofar as like ability to capture things and to the commitment of a bad actor to trying to make something like that work. All that to kind of say is that like, I think the space of cybersecurity, it's a space in software engineering that like, I think is so expertise dependent that it feels like it deserves some level of democratization. Like speaking for myself, like I know that I have a brief understanding of like cybersecurity and how someone can break a system and like kernel level access and like where it's common ways to get into that. But that is like its own hyper expansive world of knowledge. And the people who are best of it are people who are also most capable of exercising that ability. And they just so happen to be good actors, right? They happen to be like red teams and penetration testers that get hired by big companies to test these systems. I think for a small company, a startup, even medium sized company, I think what needs to happen is that there just needs to be more ability for that sort of collection of people to be able to test the security of their systems. Right now, that doesn't really exist unless you just go ahead and get a security audit. But of course, that's ephemeral, right? It only exists for however long that code continues to kind of exist the same way that it did at the audit point. I think there is a real opportunity. That's why we're seeing a lot of startups entering this space where they have some cybersecurity expert as their kind of CTO, like someone who's like can hack things on their weekend, whatever. Who are building startups, trying to automate pen testing, trying to make it easier to like expose vulnerabilities so you can then fix them. Because the matter of fact is, I don't think the open source like Jenga tower is something that's ever really going to change. I think that's kind of too implicit to the nature of like software engineering as a field, where systems like Docker, systems like Kubernetes, open source like frameworks for logging, like metrics, all that sort of stuff are just so commonly spread. And the idea of like, why would you build this if someone else already has is too implicit to the design of or the life of a software engineer. Homegrown solutions are something that is a luxury that only really like the massive companies can really afford. And so in that way, there has to be more that's done to make this sort of problem solvable at like a localized level, which I don't think currently exists.
Yeah. Interesting. Naji, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm just like thinking, like what kind of incentives? I guess this is almost an incentive, and I think like it's signaling to like a lot of companies to like revisit, their cybersecurity posture, and maybe then push like the rigor of how they test and how they, ensure like the security of their softwares and limit the amount of vulnerabilities. And I feel like that should be a good enough incentive for these companies to start focusing in that direction. But yeah, I think, it is one of those like happy failures in the sense that, hey, like now this is just like a big signal to like everyone to like, hey, check things like 4 or 5 times almost, because these are like very critical systems, right? And so might as well put in the cost to make things right first, instead of paying the cost for this failure and having your stock drop, 11% to 10, 11% in a day. And who knows what will continue on from that. But, it just shows that, I guess, like kind of trying to tie it back to what I was like initially in the introduction when I was speaking about like this like fourth industrial revolution that we're entering, and the kind of sectors of the economy that like, are going to be affected by it. And cybersecurity is one of those areas, right? Like where the way we exchange information, the way we, secure data and information like that is becoming more and more critical, which, I guess any like new grad or someone who's looking to break into like the tech world, this is a great place to, I guess, start, right? Like all this news is like signaling to people like, hey, we need better, cybersecurity engineers. We need better software engineers, just like across the board, because it just proves how critical we're becoming more dependent upon these systems, and as we become more dependent upon these systems, we need more robustness in, how they operate. So yeah, we'll see, I guess, like how, things progress from here and how they evolve, and, are there going to be any more kind of like failures that kind of come across in the next year? I mean, I feel like nowadays there's just so much news and so many things happening on the daily. There's always something new happening, new controversy. So who knows what's to come? But yeah, I think it's just a world that, we're kind of exploring and getting more, acquainted with.
One last screen share on this, and then we'll move on. I thought this one was pretty apropos. Southwest Airlines. We're getting way out of step with tech. It's a good plug for the boys.
Yeah. It's funny. It's funny. Like, maybe building quickly is not, the thing to do. They ancient.
Very good. Very good. All right, let's call it for today. We'll join everybody next week. So thank you all, as always, for joining us on this week's episode of the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Be sure to tune in next week. Catch us at all the typical podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. Subscribe and leave your comments in the section below, and we will get to them in some upcoming episodes. Thanks.